Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon to the people that are joining us online as well. So before we start, I'll just say I'm happy to take questions during the talk, also obviously after the talk, and from online participants, I guess via the chat. So I'm based in the University of Sheffield in England. We have a Centre for Machine Intelligence there, which has recently started and is across all of the university. So I guess we're trying to do something similar to you. We also have Sheffield Robotics, which has been going for over a decade now, and which I was involved in founding, which is specifically around, obviously, building embodied intelligence. And I'm funded in a European project, which is looking at artificial awareness called CAVA. So my research actually spans many areas. I'm going to try and cover some of these today, and in fact, basically, the top half of this list, which is, I would say, the sort of core science topics that I'm interested in. So I'm interested in understanding the cognitive architecture of the mind and brain, the human mind and brain, but we're mammals, and I'm interested in understanding how animals generally think, and in doing that by building embodied systems. So what are called biomimetic brain-inspired robots. And I'll explain more about that, but essentially we put brain models into robots. And I've focused mainly on two things: active touch sensing. I know there's a strong interest here in visual sensing, but also active sensing. And we did a lot of work on tactile sensing, particularly in non-human mammals. Whisker touch, this robot at the top is an example. I'll briefly talk about that. And then in the last decade, I've been more interested in memory and sense of self, and whether we could build things like episodic memory and sense of self for robots, and if so, would that be a good idea? And so the second part of the talk will focus on that. So I also would like to point you to this. So this is a handbook called the Handbook of Living Machines, Research in Biomimetic and Biohybrid Systems. We published it in 2018, and it takes, I think, a similar approach to the science of intelligence, in that we think the best way forward is to combine analytic and synthetic approaches. So analytic approaches are things like solid psychology and neuroscience, you might include philosophy there, where you look at complex systems, particularly minds and brains, and you try and understand how they operate by decomposing them, by studying them with controlled experiments and so on. And the other half of what we do is synthesis. We try and build artificial systems that have the same interesting properties as these natural systems. And when we build things, when we synthesize, we face a whole lot of different problems, but in some ways, they're different problems. And so these two approaches can be complementary. If we're trying to understand intelligence, we can try and analyze natural intelligent systems, particularly humans and other animals, but we can also try and synthesize intelligence in AI and robots. And when we build a AI system that embodies the principles that we've discovered from biology and psychology, you might say we have an existence proof for our theory of intelligence. So I think of these robots as being a step towards building an existence proof for a theory of human intelligence. And then sometimes you might advance that towards applications, and I do work in that area, but I won't talk about it today. So the other thing I'd like to point out is I published a book last year, The Psychology of AI. That's this one here. It could have been called The Science of Intelligence, because really that's what it's about. It's about comparing natural intelligence with artificial intelligence and trying to answer these questions. What is intelligence? Are brains like computers? What are the building blocks of intelligence? And then the second half of the book talks about neural networks, and then about artificial general intelligence, and where we stand today, and also the last chapter about some of the societal impacts of AI and what we might do about them. So the first half of this lecture is going to partly cover material that's in the book, and then the second half is going to diverge into other work that I've been doing recently. So I'm going to start with the question of what is intelligence, and people have different definitions of intelligence. If you look into psychology, you find, despite the fact that we've had hundreds of years of research in psychology, there isn't a consensus about what intelligence is. People generally will regard humans as an example of an intelligent system. So intelligence is what humans do, but beyond that, what can we say? Well, in psychology, there are actually two schools of thought. One very influential one is that there is some single underlying capacity for intelligence, which the people that present this idea often call G. And the idea is that you have different forms in which intelligence can manifest itself, for example, verbal tests or geometrical spatial tests and so on. But all of these are building on some underlying fundamental capacity you have for intelligence. And that's illustrated by this top Venn diagram. You've got G in the middle there, and then you've got different forms of expressing intelligence as these S's. And then the other side of the argument is what you could call the multiple intelligence view. And that has had many people in the last few decades have presented this view as an alternative to what you might see as the more traditional model of a single underlying capacity. I'm not going to talk in detail about these, but examples include Sternberg, who distinguished analytic intelligence, creative intelligence, practical intelligence. Kahneman, you might have heard of, talked about fast and slow thinking. That's still a very popular idea. And then there have been lots of books about emotional intelligence and social intelligence and how that can be different from, say, analytic intelligence. So one of the things we get from psychology, of course, is a way of trying to measure intelligence. And one of the most well-known ways of measuring intelligence is, of course, an IQ test. And IQ stands for intelligence quotient. And actually, if we look at the origin of intelligence testing, it was invented by this guy, Aravind Battaje, who was a French scientist working for the French government. And he was trying to solve the problem of children falling behind in school. And what he wanted to do was identify those children that were falling behind so that you could develop some interventions to try and help them catch up. So a very useful and worthy thing to do. And what he thought to do in order to measure how well they were doing was to try and pick some everyday tasks which wouldn't actually rely on things they've done in school, but would just require sort of life experience and an ability to read and write. So, and that's how he built the first intelligence tests. In fact, he said it matters very little what the tests are as long as they are numerous. So he was explicitly not working from a definition of intelligence. He just thought, I'll pick lots of things which people commonly regard as being linked to intelligence and have tests for those. In modern IQ tests, you often get separate scores for things like verbal comprehension, working memory, perceptual organization, and processing speed. But the old test was just a single number, and it became an intelligence quotient because the idea was that the average intelligence for your age group would be 100. So you would take your score and you would normalize it with respect to 100, and that's how you would get an IQ score, the intelligence quotient. And I wanted to show you an example of an IQ test. No doubt you've done an IQ test before. Hands up if you've done an IQ test. Yeah, so you've probably seen things like this before. So see if you can do this one. Anyone want to have a stab at that? A room full of PhD students, somebody must have. 16. 16, okay. Anyone else get a different answer? Who said 16? You sticking with that? You're right. So here's how you might do that. So the insight that you probably had, well, first of all, Peter is 12. He's 3 times his brother's age, so you can get his brother's age is 4. So how old will Peter be when he's twice the age of his brother? So the trick to answering this question is you of course realize that Peter and his brother age at the same speed. So if you can work out how much they both aged by the time Peter is twice his brother's age, you've solved the question. So what you do is you create a variable, which in computer science you might call x, and then you can write down an equation. Peter, who is 12 plus x, that should be the same age as 2 times 4 plus x. Everybody with me? Okay, and then it's just simple maths. So we expand it, we rearrange it, and we solve it. So we get x is 4. Peter will be 12 plus 4, 16, when his brother is 8. So well done if you got that, even if you were too shy to say. And if you didn't, don't worry, you've probably still got high IQ. Under pressure. What this is, in my opinion, is an example of computational thinking. I've written it down as an equation. There are other ways of solving this. One of them might be, I think they all revolve around sort of imagining this equation in some way, but rather than solving it sort of directly, as I've done here, you could also try out different values of x. So you might be doing that in your head, sort of 12 plus 1, 13 is 2 times 4, but 10, that doesn't work. So you try 2, and eventually you get 4, and that also works as a strategy. And that's also a strategy we use in computer science. So if you don't have a direct solution to something, you try out all the possible options, and you've got a fast computer, you don't worry about how long it's going to take. So I would describe this type of reasoning as computational thinking, and I would claim, and some people would argue with, that humans can do computational thinking. And certainly, some people in AI think intelligence is computation. Not everybody, but certainly a lot of people, and particularly people who work in AI, view intelligence as computation. John McCarthy, famously one of the people that founded artificial intelligence. There was artificial intelligence before John McCarthy, but it was called cybernetics. And I think he came up with the term artificial intelligence, which we now used. He said intelligence is the computational part of the ability to achieve goals in the world. Geoffrey Hinton, you've probably all heard of, one of the sort of founders of connectionism, recently resigned from Google because he's worried that AI is getting too close to human intelligence, and is a Nobel Prize winner for physics, I think, for his contributions to neural networks that are physically inspired. He said, I've always been convinced that the only way to get artificial intelligence to work is to do the computation in a way similar to the human brain. So intelligence is computation, and the way the brain does computation is the way that we should build AI. So there's a brain, there is a HP supercomputer, was the fastest computer in the world when I made the slide. They're on some level similar. Now we can discuss about that. I'm very happy to hear opinions that say intelligence isn't computation. I think they're important to consider. So the classic AI view, we might call it, and an example of that would be Alan Newell and Herb Simon, two other founders of the field. It's what we would also call symbolic computation, which the idea that literally the mind is like a computer program. And I would say that this view is out of fashion, but there may be people here who hold it. So I don't want to say it's completely wrong, but I'd say it's out of fashion. The idea is that underlying our mental structures, things like our goals and beliefs and concepts, everything we know, is what Jerry Fodor called it language of thought. So there's sort of unseen there are processes going on which are analogous to sort of a machine language, if you like. And that's all operating in a physical symbol system. And a physical symbol system, there's a famous paper by Newell and Simon about intelligent systems being physical symbol systems. The physical bit means it's an embodied machine, a piece of hardware. The symbol bit means that it does symbol processing. Symbols are like the things you have in computer programs, things like X and the numbers and operators and so on. So, and these guys were deliberately hazy about how that worked in the brain. They said that there would be some theory of how brains generated the physical symbol system. But if you look at Jerry Fodor's books, he's quite sort of dismissive of that. Says these are implementation details. We can understand the higher level language of thought. That's it. We've understood the mind. So I would say that this is unfashionable. Anyone who has subscribed to this view, particularly? No. Okay. This is maybe the view that people here subscribe to, and this is a view that I would attribute to Geoffrey Hinton, Bengio, and many of the people that have been important in neural networks. It's actually, this diagram is based on a guy called Paul Smolensky, who drew something very similar in a paper back in 1989. And this view is that we need to connect more directly between what brains do and cognitive behavior. And in fact, these things, which people might call folk psychology, they're descriptions of things that obviously we talk about, we use them, we have beliefs, we have goals, but we don't really know how they're represented in the mind and brain. But we do have cognitive behavior. We do talk, we do act, we do IQ tests, and so on. And this higher level descriptions box is where you would fit the language of thought, and the idea that the language of thought is just an approximation to what the brain actually does, which is sub-symbolic. I should stand over here and use the pointer.
So can I ask, like, what are these sub-symbolic systems?
Sorry?
What are the sub-symbolic systems?
So sub-symbolic systems are, generally speaking, things that operate on distributed representations. So it's not symbolic computation. It still can be described computationally, but the mathematics of it is much more like statistics than it is like the formal operations of logic. And if you have things like the formal operation of logic, then according to this view, that's running on a system that does sort of fuzzy, approximate statistical operations at base. And that's what subsymbols are. So subsymbols, so in a formal system, you might have a ones and zero, one is true, zero is false, and these might actually represent things in the world. You know, is it raining? Yes, that would be a one. Whereas the sub-symbolic system would have representation across a large number of different bits or bytes, if you like, and that distributed representation would encode maybe a probability that it was raining. So these sorts of differences matter when you compare sub-symbolic and symbolic theories of computation. But they're both, in my view, computational theories. It's just whether you go about it by using formal logic on this side or on the symbolic side, or you go about it by using sort of more sort of classical mathematics and differential equations and so on the sub-symbolic side. There is another view, and the view from cybernetics. I mentioned cybernetics was the science of intelligence before AI and cognitive science came along. Invented by people like Norbert Wiener and so on, way back almost before we had computers. And a guy called Ashby from the UK actually designed a physical system he called the homeostat, which was a control system which he thought resembled the brain. And this idea was to establish feedback loops with the world that maintain stability in the same way that animals maintain a stable internal environment through homeostasis. And his idea was to build control loops. So the brain is the controller, it emits actions that change the world, it perceives the effects of its actions. Controllers can be digital controllers. If you have a car with electronic ignition, that's a digital controller for a process like internal combustion. If you have a car that was built in the 1970s, it has an analog controller. There's a belt that spins around that generates sparks, which fires ignition in your car. So controllers can be analog, they can be digital. Some people will argue that the brain is more analog controlled than digital, and we can discuss that. But the other thing to say, which I think is certainly true, is that the brain doesn't operate in isolation. The brain operates through the body and in interaction with the environment. And people that take a more dynamicist perspective will emphasize this, and they will often talk about the dynamic coupling between brain, body, and environmental processes. And they will describe those things with differential equations. And there's more similarity here to subsymbolic approaches, but they're not necessarily people that endorse a computational view of the brain at all. The view that I've endorsed in the book is one that I call cyber-physical system, or the cyber-physical system hypothesis, sort of borrowing that physical symbol hypothesis notion from Newell and Simon. And the idea of a cyber-physical system is one that comes from the literature, particularly the National Science Foundation in America published this report and funded a lot of research on cyber-physical systems. And cyber-physical systems are real-world systems. They can be things like robots, but they can also be things like factories and so on. And the criteria for it being a cyber-physical system is that there should be some combination of cyber components or computational components. I've labeled them EP here for embedded processes, connected via sensors, actuators, and communications with the physical world and with other cyber-physical systems. So the emphasis here is on the physical and software components being deeply intertwined. They may be operating on different spatial and temporal scales and interacting with each other and having a very important interaction with the physical environment. So it's different from the physical system hypothesis, the physical symbol system hypothesis. It's not making any strong claim about whether it's symbolic or sub-symbolic computation you're talking about, but it is committing to some kind of computational component that's at the heart of intelligence. Any questions? I should carry on. Yeah.
How does this information transfer happen between the cyber and physical part of this in these hypotheses?
So if we're talking about real-world cyber-physical systems, then it happens in terms of communications via internet, whatever you like, sort of the ways that the high bandwidth ways in which our modern-day computer systems can talk to each other. If we're talking about humans, and humans as cyber-physical systems, it happens through language, it happens through non-verbal interactions, it happens through culture. So we share information all the time in multiple different ways. And a lot of what I think we regard of as intelligence is shared intelligence. It's things that we have in our culture. The phone in your pocket is an extension to your brain. It's a kind of cognitive prosthesis. It has lots of information there you can access very quickly. And I think that's an example of how we always have used the world. A piece of writing, a book, is another form of cognitive prosthesis. Other people are cognitive prostheses. We support each other's intelligence. Without that environment, which is full of intelligent systems, we would individually be a lot less intelligent. Okay, so dealt with some very general ideas about what the brain might be, and what I've argued in terms of a computational hypothesis, not a symbolic one. I'm actually sort of agnostic about whether symbolic computation is useful. It might be, and I think we can see in the latest large language models, people are talking about bringing in search again, which is a technique invented in symbolic AI. So it may be that ultimately that we will combine symbolic and sub-symbolic, and that symbolic models of explanation might be useful for understanding some of the things happening in the brain. For example, when you answer a question like that IQ test question. Geoffrey Hinton himself used to be a compatibilist. He used to say, we need symbolic and sub-symbolic. And then in the last 10 years, he said, oh no, it's all just connectionist. So, but he does change his mind about things. So what else can we learn about the brain? Well, so my background is in neuroscience, particularly computational neuroscience. I originally studied psychology. I transferred to AI. eventually in my mid-20s, I thought, oh, I should really learn something about the brain, shouldn't I? So fortunately, there was a guy who had the office above me in my department that studied the brain, and we started to work together. So if you don't yet study the brain, I would really recommend it, because I don't think we can understand intelligence without understanding the structure. So I think this is the brain of human, that's the brain of a rat. Obviously not to scale. The human brain has approximately 100 billion neurons, or I think 85 billion to be more accurate. The rat brain has about 1 billion neurons, so about 1% of the size. But if you look at how the brain is organized, we're both mammals. We have a shared ancestor, maybe 80 million years ago. And we share all of these same brain structures. In particular, the rat also has the cerebral cortex, like us. It has the cerebellum. The cerebellum has the most neurons of any part of the brain. The midbrain and the brainstem are really highly conserved. These areas in blue. Also has hippocampus, hypothalamus, which isn't shown in that diagram, but we do have one. It's around here, and so on. So the rat has a similar brain to us, just a smaller one. And as you'll know if you study cortex, all of cortex, the green stuff, which people often think is where intelligence lies, I think it lies in the whole brain. Cortex is this sort of 6-layered neural network. There literally are 6 layers of cells, neurons, in cortex. It's very, very thin. And in humans, there's all of these folds and creases which increase its surface area. The cortex of the rat is smooth, so less surface area. And these are neurons at the top, as drawn by Ramon Cajal, the first person really to describe neurons and neural computation. So this much we know, that this structure, which is really important, certainly in human intelligence, is the 6-layer neural network, and it's locally organized as well. So local areas of about 10,000 or so neurons are called cortical columns, and there have been many hypotheses about what a cortical column does, because if you look across cortex, it has a very similar architecture. There's visual areas, there are motor areas, there are areas for higher thought, but there's still the same kind of underlying architecture. And the idea is if you can figure that out, then you've got a quick route to understanding the brain. And I would make a claim that the cortex is a network of deep neural networks. So not quite the deep neural networks that we study in generative AI, but deep neural networks all the same, 6-layered ones. But if you consider that these are layered on top of each other, then in other words, these areas talk to each other, lower level areas feed to higher level areas, then you could think of them having more than 6 layers, potentially 12, 18, 24, or however many. So of course, certainly in the last 2 decades, people have become very interested in deep neural networks. When I started doing AI, we already had multi-layer networks, sort of the 1980s. People went from single-layer networks to multi-layer networks, multi-layer perceptrons, and the suggestion was that a multi-layer perceptron, a 3-layer network could learn anything. So why would you bother building a network with more than 3 layers? That was the consensus till around 2000, and then people started building these multi-layer networks because they had powerful enough machines to train them, and actually discovered that there was benefits to decomposing the problem over many more layers. So this is now, I guess, a sort of classic example of a feed-forward network that does computer vision. So we're feeding in the camera images here, and we're processing them. And it's a convolutional neural network, so each neuron at each level looks at a local area here, but we do the same operation across the whole of the network. And then these are the numbers of neurons at each layer. And at the top here is the classification layer, which is going to decide what's in this image. Hopefully it will come up with the conclusion that there's some children in it. So you would train this by providing it with lots of pictures and labels for those pictures. And since the early 2000s, we've discovered that this is a really effective way to do computer vision. I think neural networks started beating other solutions in computer vision in sort of the early 2000s, maybe around 2010. And computer vision now is dominated by deep neural networks. And what's interesting is if you look at the feature detectors that in this kind of network, so at these different layers, then they get increasingly complex. So at the lowest layer of the network, so if you're looking at individual cells and you're saying what kind of things that they respond to most in the local area of the image, then at the first layer above the image itself, you get things that just looking for blobs of light or a sort of light-dark contrast in a local area that looks a bit like an edge. If you look at layer 2, you get more complex features such as sort of these grids or sort of these sort of stronger sort of line-like shapes. And then layer 3, you start to look at things as a corner here or a curve or even something that's starting to approximate an eye. And layer 4 is starting to look like objects, and layer 5 even more like specific objects, like this looks like a dog, a vehicle, a face, I think, and a building. If we record in the brain, in awake humans, people with epilepsy who are having operations, and you can record in their brain, we will find neurons that have this kind of activity for different kinds of objects. A famous study found the Jennifer Aniston neuron. Heard about that one? Somebody who was having an operation, they found a neuron that typically and only responded to pictures of Jennifer Aniston, and also responded to her voice, I think. But that's an example that at that level of your brain, you have very specific responses in neurons. But Hubel and Wiesel, in experiments they did a long time ago, also got the Nobel Prize for showing that at the early stages of the visual system, the neurons respond to these kinds of features, lines and edges, and they specifically said that V1 has these kind of line detectors and suggested how they might work. So people will argue about whether training these kind of networks with back propagation is anything like the way the brain learns. It used to be claimed that the brain couldn't do back propagation. Now, various people are saying it can. I think the jury's still out on that. But however it learns, it's got a powerful learning algorithm, and it's discovering the same kinds of features as these kinds of deep neural networks are. So whether or not you're a fan of deep neural networks as a model of the brain, I think we can agree that they are successful at computer vision and close to matching human computer vision on lots of the standard tests. People will tell you that they fail that there's ways of tricking them, but of course we can trick human vision as well. Although this was happening for a long time in vision perception, it kind of went under the radar a bit in terms of public understanding of AI and science, that the general public didn't notice so much this revolution that was going on. But what happened around the 2020 and a bit the last 5 years is that we've had an explosion in a different kind of deep network, one that can solve the problem of language or address the problem of language. And of course, the first one that made the news was ChatGPT. And so we've had endless amounts of information in the regular news about AI and how AI is now surpassing humans in the language domain. I'm not going to talk about how ChatGPT works, but it is a deep neural network. It's a particular kind of deep neural network called a transformer, and it has kind of an attentional system, which is the breakthrough in terms of being able to solve sequence problems, and language is a kind of sequence problem. So ChatGPT 3.5, which was one of the ones widely talked about, I think we're on to 4 now, has about 175 billion parameters in it. And if we compare that to the human brain, people say that ChatGPT is very large, that these networks are very large, but compared to the brain, they're not especially large. That's about 1/5 of 1% of the estimated size of the connectome of our brains, which is about 100 trillion connections. So ChatGPT is big, but it's not super big. Indeed, if you look at Broca's area, which is a language area in the brain, not the only one, it has about 1.5 trillion connections. So that's still about 10 times the size of ChatGPT 3.5. So it's a big neural network, but it's getting to sort of brain scale in terms of size. So a psychologist did a verbal IQ test with ChatGPT. So they gave it the questions. Of course, we don't know if ChatGPT has previously read all the verbal IQ tests, but assuming that it hadn't, its score of 155 is pretty impressive. That's better than 99.9% of humans that the test was tried on when it was being developed. So in terms of verbal IQ, at least, large language models do well. But there's been a lot of pushback from the AI community or outside the AI community for people commenting on this. This is one famous paper. They call ChatGPT a stochastic parrot. It's written by social scientists, actually. But they claim that it's not doing anything similar to what brains in humans do. It's stitching together sequences of linguistics forms that is observed in its vast training data according to probabilistic information about how they combine without any reference to meaning, a stochastic parrot. Gary Marcus, whose background is in AI but is one of its best-known critics, said in ChatGPT's case, the mechanism of prediction is essentially regurgitation. Such systems are trained on literally billions of words of text. Their gift is in finding patterns that match what they have been trained on. So essentially, the claim is that it's it's a sort of fancy style of autocorrect. It's saying, based on what I've just seen, this is what might come next. Geoffrey Hinton has argued against this view, and if you watch some of his online talks, he presents good reasons for saying that ChatGPT is doing more than sort of a fancy style of autocorrect, and I would agree with Hinton. But I think this question of meaning is an important one because although large language models are very good at generating text, you could argue that they still don't understand anything. Anyone have a view on whether large language models understand anything? Is there certain scientists at Google thought they were conscious? Anybody there here make that claim?
Yeah, I think that because the language they use is sort of being developed by us humans, we're embedding meaning in the concepts and connections between concepts that it learns. So whatever we identify as meaning, it is passed on the connection between all concepts.
I think I agree with that. Any other views? Yeah, it's back.
I was just thinking, if it's not a stochastic parrot, then why does ChatGPT, the more you feed it with AI-generated input and media, get worse?
Well, that's what the claim is, that it's polluting its own sort of source by generating lots of AI-generating text. So ultimately, it'll get worse because it's trained off its own output. I think I agree with you that ChatGPT is really piggybacking on human intelligence because it's trained with all the stuff that we generated. So to the extent that it understands stuff, it does so because we understand stuff. It is second-hand. But I would say that it does understand it in some respects. So Gottlob Frege, do people know about him? Might even be German. Is he German? Any philosophers here?
Sounds German to me.
Yeah, well, let's assume he's German. So I'm one of the founders of Logic, and one of the people whose work led to modern-day computer science. So he was a philosopher of language, and he said there were two sides to meaning, and I kind of think this sounds right. The first one he calls sense is about the relationship between words. So how do two words, what's the relationship? So you can think obviously of synonyms, two words mean the same thing, but also antonyms, but other words have other kinds of relationships. So there's ways in which they go together. And so all of that is about sense, and it's about how words relate to each other. But he said the other side to meaning is reference, and that's the relationship of words to the world. So computer stands as a word, but also stands for this, table, is this, book is this. And so my words have reference because I know that what I'm talking about when I say book is an object like this. Arguably, large language models don't have reference, at least the ones that aren't connected to other kinds of models. And of course, now we are connecting large language models to other kinds of models. And what I argue in the book is if you do enough of that, you start to get reference. So if you have a vision model, and the visual model knows what books look like or chairs look like, and you connect that to a large language model, you can start to say it has reference. Maybe it doesn't know what it's like to sit on a chair, but it knows what a chair looks like. So my argument would be that robotics could allow AI to have a better understanding of the world, because that sort of physical presence and sort of direct experience of the world means you could build reference. I think what Frege called reference, I think a robot can have, because this robot here can pick up this object, can touch the table. Those things start to have meaning in relation to the real world. It can learn the words for things based on what they look like and what you can do with them. So what more can we learn by looking at the brain? So people focus a lot on cortex, but of course there's much more to the brain. There's everything that is subcortical. And even people that study the brain mostly study cortex. One reason is it's much easier to get an electrode into this bit because you just have to go through the skull and into the very top of it and you start to measure in it, where it's much harder to measure down here in the brain. That doesn't mean that important stuff doesn't go on down here. I think there's a story about a man who lost his keys on a dark night, and he was searching for them, and he was searching underneath a lamppost, and somebody said to him, well, why aren't you searching over there? I thought you searched them over here. I'm searching here because that's where the light is. So, you're searching here because that's where it's easy to measure. But we should also be looking here, and I would say not 95% of neuroscience is focused on this bit of the brain. The other reason, of course, is that this bit of the brain is massively expanded in humans, or relatively expanded, and other primates compared to other mammals, so you might say it makes us distinctive. So I'm interested in the brain as having a layered architecture. What I mean by that is that we can think of the hindbrain, which is this bit up to here, the midbrain, which includes those bits of the brain which are hidden under the cortex. You can see them better here. These are the midbrain areas here. And then this is an area of the brain called the diencephalon, and this is the telencephalon. But these hindbrain and midbrain systems also can solve problems. There's a vision system in the midbrain, which is semi-independent of the vision system in the forebrain. You can see it more easily in the rat. These structures here, the colliculus. The superior colliculus focuses vision and touch particularly, and it talks to the vision system in the cortex. You can remove the cortical vision system and you can still get some visual function from the superior colliculus. So my colleague who taught me neuroscience studied colliculus. He used to remove the cerebral cortex from a rat in order to more easily access the colliculus, and he said for most things it didn't really matter if you didn't have that. You need to do some specific tests on learning to show that the cortex was missing. Not true of a human, we're more reliant on cortex, but in other animals, reptiles particularly, most of the visual processing is in the midbrain. So I'm interested in understanding the brain as a layered architecture. One reason is that we also know from robotics that layered control systems are often more robust. So Rod Brooks, you may have heard of, famously talked about building layered control systems. This was at a time when robots were particularly slow and brittle. They're still quite slow and brittle, actually, but not as bad as they were back then. And he suggested, let's build some low-level, fast and flexible stuff that just does the basics, and then we can add slow, flexible stuff on later to do more sophisticated forms of control. He only really got about one layer up in this, and then he lost interest and did something else. But I believe in this strategy, and I think that our brains have also adopted the strategy that we have multiple layers of control. The cortex is this highest, in some sense slowest, but most flexible layer of control. If the cortex get a visual signal, it takes about 60 milliseconds before anything really starts to happen. And then it can take several seconds before you respond. But the midbrain visual system is much faster. The midbrain sound system, auditory system is super fast. The touch system responds within about 5 milliseconds and so on. So you get faster responses in these lower level brain systems. Another thing to say is that when you're born, you have your cortical neurons, but they're not wired up yet. So if you have a newborn, it's essentially a midbrain animal. It's running on midbrain systems. So these are the vertebrate animals. I just wanted to show, because we looked at humans and rats before. We're both mammals. This is now across all of the different vertebrates. But just to show you that all of these vertebrate animals have this roughly the same brain structures. So again, we've got sort of cortex or its equivalent in white here, and you can see that frogs have it, fish have some of it, sharks have some of it. Even the jawless fish, like a lamprey, has a bit of it. Cerebellum, it's everywhere except possibly not the lamprey, but it may have lost it secondarily. And this sort of purple bit is this midbrain sensory system, very important in fish and amphibians, less important in mammals, where the cortex is expanded. And one of the reasons the cortex has expanded for vision is that our ancestors probably evolved to survive at night time, and they had to do multisensory integration in order to do that, whereas most reptiles are diurnal, so they can rely more on these subcortical systems, and they don't need so much integration. So if we look across all vertebrates, actually the brain architecture is conserved, but it is this layered brain architecture. So the hypothesis is that these bits evolved in pre-vertebrate ancestors, so 500 million years ago. So the first fish around 450, 500 million years ago had this kind of a brain already. So I'm going quite slowly, so I'm not going to get to the end of the talk, but we're stopping at 4:45, is that right?
You can also go a little longer.
Well, we can go as long as you like to go, but I can take questions at any point as well. So if you disagree with me, disagree. I'm saying things that not everyone agrees with.
So maybe we'll go to 4:15, and then if we run out of questions, you can continue.
Well, I've got slides. I think we can go to 4:15, but we'll take questions as we go along. So what I do is brain-based robots. So what that means is that I take computational neuroscience of a neural circuit and I plug it into a physical model of the sensor and motor systems, in other words, into a robot. And I try and control the robot with the computational model of the brain. Now, I haven't got a complete model of the brain, so I build what I call an embedding architecture, which makes this work. So there's lots of other bits of my robot control system which aren't brain-like, and they're engineered. I suspect that anybody who does embodied robotic models of the brain is using an embedded architecture. There's other stuff that they built that will make it work. And so when you publish this stuff, you should say what else you're using to make it work in order that it can be replicated. And we can question as to whether it's actually the bit of the brain that you've modeled that's solving the problem, or these other bits that you've built. So, so these are some robots. So these first two we built about a dozen different whiskered robots. So, as I mentioned, we're interested in active touch sensing in animals like rats and mice. They use their whiskers to sense the world. And these robots, you can see that they don't have legs and feet. We just tried to simulate the physical aspects of whisking in something which is about 5 times the size of a rat. Now, we've also done quite a lot of work on humans and humanoids, and this is a commercial robot we built that was based on some of the principles developed, particularly in these early rat-like robots. And these are the architectures, and you can see that they're all sort of layered or looped architectures. This is the one that we've been using in the humanoid, the iCub, actually this is an architecture developed by Paul Verschoor, but it's the same general principles that we have multiple layers, and the higher layers are slower but more flexible, and the lower layers are faster and inflexible. And this is the one in our commercial robot. So just a little bit more about the whiskered robots. So this is a rat. This is actually a pet rat on my windowsill of my house in Sheffield. Just in case you don't know, that rats, when they use their whiskers, they move them back and forth. And they do that about 10 times a second. This is slowed down so that you can see the whiskers. But also, they do it in a really sophisticated way. They are controlling the amplitude of the whiskers, but also you can see there's sort of bilateral changes in amplitude. And you can see when it leans into this cup, that the whiskers are pushing forward and the whiskers on the two sides are actually moving, not independently, but there's some decoupling. So there's something quite sophisticated going on here. I would compare it to when you investigate something with your fingers. Your fingers are not completely decoupled, but they're not also completely coupled either. So you use your whole hand to investigate, and the rat uses its whole whisker field.
Okay, so how do you teach, like, for example, the whisker robot, like, how to make sense of the world?
Well, let me give you some examples. So, I would say first off, there's very little learning in the systems we build. We hardwire them based on brain theory. So we do some learning where we don't know what the parameters should be, but often we can just hardwire it to work. So this is one of the most recent robots we built. This is called Whiskeye. The video is by Martin Pearson at Bristol Robotics Lab, and he's the guy that builds the robots. And in Sheffield, we contribute the brain models and the embedding architecture. So you can see it's about the size of a dog. It's investigating Martin's hand with its whiskers. You can see it's got short whiskers, which are similar to the microvibrissae of mice and rats. So they have whiskers around their mouth, which are short, and they don't move. And it has long whiskers that do move, like the mouse and rat. And Whiskeye also has eyes. So there's these little cameras here. So our other whiskered robots just had whiskers, but rats have eyes. So we added some eyes, and we started to look at how vision and whisking work together. But that was what we did in the Human Brain Project. So, and I don't want to spend a long time with it, but this is the architecture. So that's the brainstem. There's a structure in the brainstem called a trigeminal complex, which talks to the whiskers, called the brachy. And then there's a loop through the trigeminal complex, sorry, that's a trigeminal ganglia, so that's a nerve. Trigeminal complex that goes back to the whiskers via the facial nucleus that can control the movement of the whiskers directly. And then there's another loop, and this one goes through the midbrain, the superior colliculus, and that also goes back to the facial nucleus. And then there's a third loop, and that goes up to the sensory cortex, an area called the barrel cortex, and that, of course, also comes back eventually to the vibrissae. People who study the rat whisker system generally study these structures, but actually there's a lot already going on down here. And this loop is much faster than that one. And this loop actually controls, we think, the amplitude of the whisking. So a lot of the exploratory stuff is controlled here, but modulated certainly by this upper level loop. So these are different structures in the brain, and some of the models we've built of them sort of very briefly here. We've modeled different areas of the brain. So the pattern generator we know to be down here in the brainstem, and that's linked to the pattern generator for breathing, although they're not, again, tightly coupled, but they are loosely coupled. So when the rat is sniffing, it's also moving its whiskers in a coupled way. This bit, the cerebellum, we're working on the hypothesis that one of the roles of the cerebellum, there's many, is to cancel noise due to self-movement. So when the rat moves its whiskers, there'll be some, you'll detect some signals at the whisker base that are due to the movement of the whiskers and not due to contact with something in the world. Without the system, our robot will think it's touched something, and it hasn't. It's just noise. And the cerebellum can predict what sensory signals you would expect because you've moved the whiskers, and it can subtract those away. And we think that's a general thing that the cerebellum does, is to predict and cancel sensory noise. We have a model of the superior colliculus, which controls the whisking amplitude. So if you have a touch here, you can modulate how much the whiskers are moving, and that can happen really quickly. We have a model here of hippocampus, and that can build maps of the world based on touch. So you do path integration, you collect touch signals, and you can build a map. I think this was one of the first sort of examples of a map built purely by touch, certainly whisker touch. We have a model of a set of structures called the basal ganglia that do decision making. I don't think that video is working, but if it did, it would show it selecting between different actions. And we built various models of cortex. Most of the time, we just actually run the system without any cortex, but we have built models of cortex because we are interested ultimately in the more sophisticated feature detection that's happening up here. So that's really by way of background, just to say I think we can understand the brain using robots, and here's an example of how we've done it. Or more recently, by which I mean sort of in the last sort of decade and a half, we've been looking at this architecture, which I mentioned from Paul Bashore, and we spent 6 years building it into an iCub humanoid robot, and that was a collaboration across all of these different groups. And we finished about 2018, so before large language models. We were trying to build integrated systems that could give the robot a sense of self. I'll say more about that in a second. This video might have sound. No, the one I'll play later, I have the sound turned up. But let me just explain. No, I'll explain it in a minute when I get back to it. So I want to jump topic here. So any questions before we move on? Yeah.
So I think it came up a bit before this. You're assuming that intelligence relies on the interaction with the world and our physical existence. That's the premise of the first talk, right?
Yes.
But this assumes that there is only one kind of... So I can imagine a software that also interacts with what is in the memory and what is in the cache, and that's for... It can still develop an intelligence. It's not going to be the same as we have, but this is the thing, like what separates hardware from software, assuming that there is an intelligence as a general thing, or you're interested in intelligence for animals, not any intelligence?
I'm interested in intelligence, but animals are the only example we have of intelligent systems at the moment, because we haven't met any aliens yet that are intelligent. All the intelligent life on the planet is animal. I mean, a lot of it's invertebrates. So I'm focusing on vertebrates because you can't study everything, but there are lots of people studying insect intelligence, and there are similarities but also important differences there. Octopus, obviously, perhaps the most sophisticated of the invertebrates and very intelligent animals. So those are alternative architectures that you could look at here. But I think generally embodied, I'm sort of, there could be disembodied intelligence. I mean, the AIs are currently disembodied, and I would argue that they're at least partially intelligent. So I think there can be disembodied intelligence. To what extent you need to have an embodied intelligence to have meaning, I think, is an interesting and important question. And I also think when we come to sense of self, could there be something that it's like to be an AI? I think if it's embodied, it's more likely to have a sense of itself. So when people say, well, you know, is there something that ChatGPT decide one day, or some other large language model that, you know, it has motivations, it wants to take over the world, the sort of thing that people worry about. You know, I don't think that's likely, because I don't think it has a sense of self. I don't think it has a sense of what it is as an agent, but it could do these things. So, but I think it's open to whether or not it would need to be deeply embodied to do these things. AIs can obviously interact with the world directly through robotic bodies or through other sensors. So whether you need a body or whether you just need sensors and other ways of interacting with the world, I think these are all open questions. But for me, sort of, I'm interested in understanding human intelligence fundamentally, and everything else is a sort of this is interesting because it casts some light on human intelligence for me. So that's why I study animal intelligence. That's why I study AI. Any other questions? Okay, we can move on to the sort of the second part of the talk, or it's less than half of the talk, you're pleased to know. So, but it's the stuff I work on at the moment. So, the old man looks in the mirror and sees himself as the younger man. So you're mostly younger people, but I can promise you, as you get old, you physically age in your appearance, but internally you might feel you're more or less the same person. And Aaron Sloman, who's an emeritus professor at Birmingham, once, and he does AI, once said to me, I'm always surprised when I look in the mirror and see myself, because that's not the person that I feel I am inside. So this picture kind of depicts that idea that you feel you're the same person throughout your life, even though your physical body is changing and aging. So, and this idea that you are the same person throughout life is big in our culture. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." He thought there was this self that was kind of unanalyzable. You couldn't really break it down, and it was there, and it was what gave him truth, whereas he couldn't necessarily trust his senses. Various other philosophers disagreed with that. I mean, David Hume thought there wasn't really a self in that level, but I think generally in our culture, we think that we have selves, and selves are important. We talk about motivation as being something that we have as selves. We have a story about ourselves we tell to other people, and so on. So I think robotics could help us answer these questions of what a self is, and maybe then also help us to understand ourselves better. And these are a list of things that I think robotics can help with. The first question is, what is a self? Let's get to the third one here. What are the different kinds of self? What is the simplest form of self? Could a single-cell organism have a sense of self? How simple a robot would we have to build to have a sense of self? What are the requirements for selfhood? For example, do you have to have a body? And what is the functional architecture underlying the experience of being a self? So, I've been talking to you about layered architectures, and particularly the ones that we see in animal brains. And are some aspects of the architecture necessary to have a sense of self? So there's a lot of papers that we've done on this. The most recent one is this Science Robotics Review, Understanding the Sense of Self Through Robotics. It just came out last year. You should be able to get a copy online. If not, you can email me. I think if you go to my homepage, you can download it directly from there if you can't download it directly from anywhere else. And we reviewed a lot of research from our group, but also from lots of other groups about that. So my background, as I said, is in psychology. What I'm interested fundamentally in is describing what I would call the psychological phenomena of self. In other words, the things that we observe as psychologists that people do, or which we generally think are related to self. And I put up a list here, and it's color-coded. And I'll quickly go through some of the list. So the three at the top, sensing the body, distinguishing yourself from the world, having a point of view, are to do with the sort of physical self, what Ulrich Neisser called the ecological self, the self in the world. And the fundamental thing here is that you have a self-other distinction. There is you and there's not you. This is me, this is not me. So, and also you have a point of view, so you see the world from inside your head, generally looking out. If you're a Buddhist, you can. They tell me that they can imagine themselves being here or being here. I've never done that. If you do that, I'd be interested to talk to you. I see the world from inside my head, looking out through my eyes, and that's my point of view. When we wrote this paper, I wrote a robot obviously has a point of view because it has sensors, it has the configuration. If the robot's there, nobody else can be in that space. And then the reviewer said, no, robot can't have a point of view because it's a robot. So it was obviously controversial. But I would still claim that if you have a robot, it has a camera, it looks out on the world, then I think that point of view of the robot is, where that camera is looking, particularly if that's its main sensor. So, and then there's a bunch of things, in purple here, which are to do with agency. So yourself is an agent. You do things, you feel you're making choices, you take actions, you know when something happens and you cause it to happen, or if something happens and you didn't cause it to happen, you know it wasn't you that caused it to happen. So that is to do with agency. The next few things are to do with being aware of where you are and when you are. So I'm aware that I'm in Berlin. I'm aware that it's Friday. I'm also aware that yesterday I was in Sheffield. Monday I'll be back in Sheffield. So I can think about my personal past and my future and imagine where I'll be. People that have Alzheimer's can lose this sense of themselves in time. It's one of the things that's particularly vulnerable in dementia. So they may not be able to remember much about the past or imagine the future, and they may be confused about where they are. The next few things are about the interpersonal self. So you think of other people as also being selves, but actually young infants sort of before the age of sort of 3 don't have what psychologists call theory of mind. They're not able to think about other people having different thoughts and points of view than themselves. I don't know if any of you are parents. Any parents? So if you might notice if your kids hit 3 that they start to appreciate that mum or dad has a life outside looking after them. I think I noticed this, and it's quite a relief. Because you can explain that to a 2-year-old and they just look at you. Don't know what you mean. I mean, before that, they may think you still exist when you go out of the room, but they certainly don't think that you have a life outside of them. They're not really focused on that. So, and then we've got in red, having beliefs about who you are, having personal goals, and a life story. That's your concept of who you are. And then finally, in white, I put everything which is to do with experience and consciousness, because people often confuse the self with consciousness. We can talk about that, but I think the self is distinct from this notion of experience and consciousness. And we could build all these other things and then see if the robot talks about its inner life and its experience. And then we could ask, does it have consciousness? So some people would claim, Anil Seth, for example, would claim you can build all these other things for a robot and it still wouldn't have consciousness. And we can group these. We can group the ecological and the agential self. We might call it the core self, and these other ones we might call the extended self. And one reason for grouping that way is that infants don't have all this other stuff. Infants just have this core stuff. They have a point of view. They know what's not them and what's not them. They probably know that when they're a fetus, before they're born. They have a sense of body ownership and they have a sense of agency. So they have a feeling, I don't know what they feel like, but we can do tests which show that they can make actions and distinguish between things that they cause to happen and things which just happen. They don't have mirror self-recognition, so an important test in this space is if you put a mark on somebody's forehead and they look in a mirror, they will rub their forehead. Oh, I've got a mark there. And you can do that with a chimpanzee, and they'll also do that. If you do that with the dog, it will bark at the thing in the mirror. It thinks it's another dog. Most animals don't pass the mirror test, and 2-year-olds mostly don't pass the mirror test. 3-year-olds mostly do. Yeah.
Can I ask something about the dog thing?
Yeah.
Because their main sense with which they interact with the world is not vision. Would they mix themselves up with another dog by smell?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if there's a olfactory equivalent.
Because I always think it's like it's anthropocentrism, right? I think we do our paradigms from psychology, we apply it to animal stuff, and then we are like, oh, they can't do it, therefore they don't have that ability. But
yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. I mean, the elephants, I think, pass the mirror test. Some birds. So, but yeah, I think it's not a perfect test for self-recognition. But I guess you could say that if there's a positive thing, if you positively do identify yourself, then you can say you've recognized yourself in the mirror. If you fail the mirror test, you can't necessarily say that they don't know it's them. They just haven't passed the test. So, and I won't go down that list, but these are all things that we don't think infants have. Stream of consciousness, obviously, question mark about that. We don't know what it's like to be an infant, and nobody remembers, tragically, what it's like to be an infant. So Daniel Dennett talked about the minimal self. It's not a thing inside a lobster or lark. So it's not a thing. It's not the whole lobster or the whole lark either. It is something abstract, which amounts just to the existence of an organization which tends to distinguish, control, and preserve portions of the world, an organization that thereby creates and maintains boundaries. So there's quite a lot of definitions of the minimal self, but I like this one because Daniel Dennett usually chooses his words carefully. And I like this idea that it's an abstraction, that it's an organization, and that it distinguishes portions of the world, particularly things that are inside or part of the body and things that are outside. And that suggests we can build bodies or robots, and that embodiment is important for sense of self, even for a minimal self. And bodies might be important for several reasons. First, because they establish that boundary between the self and the world, of which Dennett is talking about, which infants already have. And second, I think people don't talk about this so much, they provide a predictable and consistent setting in which the self awakens to find itself. So my view of self, and I think John Locke also thought this, was that when you're asleep, certainly when you're deep asleep, you're no longer a thing, you're no longer a self. When you wake up, all of these self processes become active. They may be active in dreaming and so on. And if you wake up, like in the Kafka novel, in the body of a giant insect, you may have a different experience of self than if you wake up in your normal body, which of course most of us do, thankfully. And that predictable and consistent setting says, okay, I know who I am, I know what I got to do today, and so on. People with Alzheimer's often put a picture of themselves with their family by the bed so that they can remind themselves when they wake up who they are, who their family members are. So it's not absolutely straightforward that you remember who you are when you wake up. People do forget themselves completely sometimes with brain damage. So I think the body is important, first of all, in there being a distinction between me and other, and also in building that. So in the science robotics paper, we talk about all these different aspects of self, which are the ones in color here, which are different sort of psychological things, if you like, phenomena related to self. They've been investigated in different robots, so you can find the references in the paper. These are the different, in black, there's the different aspects of self. We can link them to, I'm not going to go through those. But there's this minimal self in orange, which is emerging really from before birth. And then this extended self, which is emerging at earliest by about the first year. So the sense that you persist in time, for example, I'll talk a bit more about that. So there are lots of interesting models of the self. So I'm sure most of you know about predictive processing. Have you heard about predictive processing? Yep. So I'm not going to explain it here, except to briefly say the idea is that the higher levels of your brain, specifically the cortex people tend to talk about, make predictions about what sensory inputs you're going to experience. And then the lower levels of the brain, generally they mean the cortex, are passing up prediction errors. So they're saying, do those predictions match what I'm seeing? If they do, fine. If they don't, there's an error signal. And that's what you use to change the brain. So this has become massive in AI and cognitive neuroscience. Probably people are building these predictive processing here. Some of them are based on the free energy principle. Pablo Lanilos, who's now in Madrid, has done some nice work to try and connect that to robots and has built a robot that can pass a mirror test using a kind of predictive processing model. This is a Frontiers paper giving a sort of perspective on what the sense of self is from this predictive processing perspective. So I kind of buy into this, but I also take this layered architecture view. And in the layered architecture view, we would have multiple solutions. We wouldn't necessarily use these sort of classic predictive processing algorithms. So one thing we're doing at the moment is we're exploring whether we can build a self-other distinction based simply on correlation learning, so not predictive, not prediction error. So we've got interoception, proprioception of the robot. We've got exteroception, particularly vision. So the proprioception is telling me how I'm moving my arm. The exteroception is I see an arm, or I see things, I see the world and I see something moving in it. And segment the world into me and not me. I don't have the results on the slide because I forgot to put on the computer before I left Sheffield, but we do have initial work which shows that works. But then on top of that, we're building a predictive model that takes the actions you're making and then says these are the sensory consequences we would expect to see, well, exteroceptive and proprioceptive. So this is more like the classic predictive processing. And one of the hypotheses we want to test is that this kind of correlation learning might be more like what the infant has, and then you would build this on later. So I think this video has some sound. So this is a longer video, and it is from sort of 2017, before large language models. So, but the language that the robot is using is pre-coded, but it's using it in particular situations. So I would say that the words do have reference. And one of the things, I think this clip might be it learning a label for its own hand. And it's learning what it can do with its hand. It can look at its hand. It can also compare its own hand to the researcher's hand. And so those are all things that establish reference.
Watch, please. I will move a part of my body. So, how do you call this part of my body?
This is your hand.
I've understood this is your hand. Nice. I know that I am the hand. Actually, I found similar parts of your body. Let me show you on the screen. Look, because our hands look the same, I know this is your hand.
So that's quite a long video. I'm not going to show it all. But what I'd say is that I think there's reference there. The robot knows it has a hand. It can move its hand. It knows what signals it has. It knows what it looks like for the hand to move. It also knows that the human hand is similar to its own hand. It can make a mapping between those. So we're building some of the components for sense of self and even the interpersonal self here. And we're building reference, I think, for AI. So I'm going to finish. Okay, your question, yeah.
Does it have to be like a child's voice and a creepy face?
We didn't choose the robot's eye cover.
It's crazy.
It's creepy?
It's a bit creepy.
It's a really popular robot. Do you not have one here? Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a child's voice, but it isn't a full-size figure. But, any other questions? Yeah.
How does it know how to point? At some point it's moving the hand and then it's saying, pointing with the camera and pointing with the hand.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is probably pre-wired, maybe, that it knows how to point. We didn't work on that part of the project. We worked on episodic memory. This is IIT, who built the robot and did a lot of the proprioceptive control. So yeah, it knows how to point to objects. There will be papers on this, and they'll be in that publication. I'm sorry, that's all I can say. But yeah, it might be hardwired. There is some learning there. The iCub learns the body model, for example. And there's some really nice papers on its learning its body model through touch. And there's evidence that infants learn that they are distinct from the body through self-touch. Because in the room, obviously it's dark, but you can touch yourself. You can touch the lining of the room. And here you get a double touch experience. I feel touch on my fingertips. I also feel touch on my skin. And there I just feel single touch experience. And that could be the basis of saying, oh, this is self, this is other, that I can make that distinction. People have built models of that with the reference in the paper.
Watch, please.
So I want to finish by talking about the sense of self in time. So this is a Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin and Hobbes are quite keen that you don't show these things on the internet. So, but it's a great little cartoon. I should just get an AI to make a version of it, and then it will be fine. So, Calvin says, I got a letter from my past self. And Hobbes says, what's it say? Dear future Calvin, I wrote this several days before you will receive it. You've done things I haven't done. You've seen things I haven't seen. You know things I don't know. You lucky dog. Your pal Calvin. Oh, I feel so sorry for myself 2 days ago. Poor you, he wasn't. Poor him, he wasn't you. So I like this because it actually summarizes what a lot of philosophers worry about. So they worry about why you should care about the person who's going to be in your body tomorrow or next week or next year. And I don't know if you've ever worried about this, but there are books written on this topic, that that's a different person. You fall asleep, you wake up, another person inhabits your body, goes about their life. Why should you care about them and do anything today that's going to make their life better? In normal life, we don't worry about that. We just get on with things and we plan for the future. And we do that because we've got a sense of ourselves persisting in time, which is where I kind of started. And so I'm interested in this phenomenon of this experience of the self as persisting, because I don't think it is a given. If you do robotics, every time you switch on your robot, it's not waking up to think, oh, I was here yesterday in this lab doing these experiments, what are we going to do today? It's a new instantiation of the robot, unless you specifically built episodic memory. Anyone building episodic memory for robots? No? Are there robots here? Anybody building episodic memory in the group for robots? Okay, well, I would claim that none of your robots know that they exist in time. And I think that's a real limitation of robots, because when people interact with robots, particularly social robots, and they talk in adult-like language, we project all sorts of human-like qualities onto them, and one of them would be, oh, you know that you're the same person yesterday and tomorrow. So if I come into your lab and do an experiment, and I was here last week doing an experiment, you should remember me. And of course the robot doesn't. So can we build that for robots? I think we can. But it's interesting to look at the emergence of this, because I don't think the 1-year-old really knows about itself as existing in time either. This is based on reading of developmental literature. And this is a figure I've just redrawn from 2 developmental psychologists, Salazzo and Somerville. Briefly, before you're about 1-year-old, you don't really have a sense of yourself existing in time at all. You're just living in the now. And we're often told that we should live more in the now. But if you aren't able to time travel into the past and the future, actually that's quite limiting. And as a human, that's one of the things that define us, that we can do this. When you're a year old, you start to sort of notice things which are familiar about stuff you've seen before, and maybe you start to care about things in the future. So there's the beginnings of a feeling that you persist in time. And the claim I'm making is that when you're about 1.5 years old to about 3 years old, you do distinguish between past, now, and future, but there isn't a timeline particularly for the past and the future. And that doesn't really start till you're about 3 years old. And it's clear really in children that are about 4 years old, 5 years old, and they go to school. And this is when children start to tell you about stories about what they did during the day. Younger children don't do that. They don't have this ability to have a narrative self, to have a life story. And partly that's because they just don't, younger children don't have that sense of time passing that we have as adults. So, of course, we could give a robot a clock so it could tell you exactly what day of the week it is, but it being able to remember something appropriate from a past experience is very different. You can record everything that happened in the lab last week, but that doesn't mean the robot can access relevant information from that interaction, which it might need to have a conversation with you now. And that's what's different. If we look at how the brain works, the event memory system, which is the system in your brain which retrieves memories about the past, it's one word for it, is the same system, or as the claim is made, that you use when you imagine the future. And we know that because parts of the brain, including the default mode network, which some of you may work on or know about, parts of the brain which are active when you're doing this mental time travel into the past are also active when you're imagining the future. So we started using generative models to try and sort of encode stuff about the past in a way that's useful. Here we were just encoding faces. I'm going to skip this because I've been talking a long time. We did it with tactile sensing. So there's a whole bunch of different things we did. There's sort of motion recognition here, face recognition, voice recognition. And so we could remember stuff that happened in the past and match it to what was happening today. And we also were interested in trying to reconstruct memories. So the iCub robot has a 3D simulator, and the idea would be to populate the simulator with memories. So you might remember a particular person, particular face, a particular object, and some action that they made on it. So we started to do that. What's interesting, and this study here shows it, so I've lost the pointer.
It's under the two. So I went on.
This study, which is not one of ours, but it shows parts of the brain that light up when you remember something. So the first part to light up is an area of the hippocampus here. So you're remembering a memory for a scene, for example. And then there's other parts of the cortex light up next. And then some of the last parts of the cortex to light up are the primary sensory cortices. So this light blue one here is visual cortex. And what they found was that if there's a particular vivid memory, then you get a strong correlation with activity in the visual cortex. If it's a less vivid memory, you have less activity here. So when you're remembering something vividly, you're actually reconstructing the perceptual experience that you had at the time. And that's what the memory is. Endel Tulving, the psychologist, described the experience of remembering as a form of consciousness, autonoetic consciousness, he called it, self-knowing consciousness. So if we can build a robot that can reconstruct past experience and relive the sensory experience of that, perhaps it can have that sort of self-knowing consciousness. Right, before I break my computer, I'm going to show you. So, to wrap up, I would argue that human intelligence is a form of embodied computation. So I would make a claim that it's computational, not necessarily symbolic, not necessarily just a Turing machine-like computation, but still computation. Humans, like robots, are a form of cyber-physical system. We have this deeply integrated software, if you like, which is the nervous system interacting with the body and the environment. Minds are layered control systems. I didn't talk so much about abstraction boundaries, but it was in one of the slides. The higher levels of the layered control system don't need to know in detail what the lower level systems are doing. And I think that our conscious minds are inhabiting our cortical brain primarily. And so, of course, they get signals from other brain areas and they're interpreting them, but they don't know the detail of what's happening in lower areas of the brain. There's a phenomenon called blind sight, which I think is controversial, but some experiments show that people who have damage to the visual area of cortex are still able to point to targets. So you move something in the visual field of somebody who seems to be blind, and they can point to it, and they can't tell you how they pointed to it. That could be their midbrain. So they don't have access to the processing in the midbrain, which is allowing them to do that. And I think that's interesting, because there's a lot of brain we don't have access to. So psychotherapists talking about making the unconscious conscious. So maybe with therapy, you could have more access. So I think the inference to a self that provides the high-level cause for sensory predictions and endures over time. So I think that the self is this model that the brain computes. It infers that it exists as the best way of explaining the experience that it's having. So that's a kind of predictive processing view. You know, why is there this experience? Oh, I must have a self. I'm distinct from the world. I've got a boundary. I've got a point of view. Things are happening to me. I'm making things happen. That's what I am. I am a self. And I think that's reinforced by culture. I haven't said much about consciousness, but I think the sort of self-consciousness, awareness of yourself, is very momentary. We have fleeting moments when you're thinking about yourself, and then you go back into doing what you were doing. And that's when you focus your mental state towards that self-model, but most of the time we're not doing that. And I think that robotics is a good vehicle for for trying to test our ideas about intelligence and what the self is. Thanks very much.